Sorbo. You've heard me talk about Mike Lindell, who I adore. You know, he's the inventor of My Pillow, and how that pillow has given me a good night's sleep that I need. In fact, I never knew how good I could sleep before I had My Pillow. Mike continues to roll out new offers on his products, and the latest one is on his towel sets. Towels aren't something you think about often. I never knew what I was missing until I tried the towels just last year. Now, you have all helped build My Pillow into the incredible company that it is today, and you've trusted Mike Lindell to give you a great night's sleep. Mike's now changing the game with his 6-piece towel set. The set's made with USA cotton, making it extremely absorbent, and yet still providing that soft feel you look for in a towel. The set comes with 2 bath, 2 hand towels, and 2 washcloths, typically retailing for $109.99. But for a limited time, you can get this set for the low price of $39.99. And that's using promo code Sam Sorbo. So remember, all My Pillow products come with a 60-day money-back guarantee. You just go to mypillow.com, click on the radio listener specials to get this insanely low price of $39.99 on the towel set. You'll find deep discounts on other My Pillow products as well. So enter promo code Sam Sorbo, or you can call 800-625-5983. That's 800-625-5983 for these great radio specials. Hi, this is Sam Sorbo. I want to invite you all to join me at the Playbook for Home Learning Conference put on by Underground Education. There's a new community that started online called the Underground Education Community. You can find it by going to samsorbo.com. You can also find all the information about the conference, about how to approach education with your kids. Times are hard for parents right now. There's a lot going on in the schools that we don't like. But I'll tell you something, home learning is easier than you ever thought it could be and more fun than you ever imagined. So join me at the Your Playbook for Home Learning Conference this June 24-25 in Port St. Lucie, Florida. And we're going to have a great time. Go to samsorbo.com for more information on everything. I'll see you there. Sam Sorbo for the Sam Sorbo Show here. I'm here with Chris McKinney. He is the brain behind the outfit doing this documentary that we've been here filming. My husband's filming it. I'm literally just along for the ride. But I've been learning so much. Chris is a scholar of ancient, well, the Old Testament basically, ancient times, I should say. He has also an interest in Greek mythology and other mythologies as well.
Yes, yeah, hobby.
He's extraordinarily he's almost too knowledgeable. You're a bit of a nerd, dude.
I agree. I like I like knowledge and learning about all kinds of the ancient world.
I hope they can hear.
Yeah. Okay. So I love learning about the ancient world. I love the story of ancient Israel. I love and how that intersects really with just human history in general. And so if you mentioned mythology, it's just to see how people have tried to make sense of the divine. First of all, I love to see it in the biblical text, where we have actually a revelation from God, a special revelation, but then also comparing that to the nations around Israel and seeing the similarity between those other nations and the things that they thought about, and how really you can see that as kind of the image of God that is on people's hearts.
So other people's histories that strangely match up in different ways with the biblical texts.
Yeah, and this is like what C.S. Lewis called these true myths, these myths that are out there that are reflecting of the human yearning for truth. Why is it that every major mythology, whether we're talking about Egypt or Canaanite or Greek, that you have a dying and rising God, whether it's Osiris or Balder in Norse mythology or Persephone in Greek mythology, and there's others, they're all always there. And whereas in Christianity, we have the myth made fact, that it's the true myth. And so that's just one aspect of that overall thing, but knowing the history and putting it together with these big stories, I think, make it really interesting, and something that always draws me in.
Right. I wonder though, because we see this dying and resurrection, or death and resurrection myth so commonly, it's easy for people to just discount the Bible.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great point, and I think that that's what people do. They either approach it from a critical perspective of, well, the Old Testament Hebrew religion that we see there, or the continuation of that in the New Testament, with the resurrection of Jesus and the promise of the resurrection of everyone who follows him, that this is just kind of a continuation of these other religions, and therefore it's to be discounted. And to me, I say, yes, it is a continuation of those human yearnings, but instead of getting to the point, as all these other religions do, where death is undefeatable, right? Baal and Mot, the Canaanite god of fertility and who brings back the spring, and Mot, the god of death, they're locked in an ever-ending struggle that no one can win. Well, we get to 1 Corinthians 15, this great resurrection passage in Paul. Death, where is your sting? That death is swallowed up in victory. Or in Revelation 21, death and Hades are thrown into lake of fire, because death is actually defeated by Jesus. And so in some sense you might say the pagan conception of the never-ending cycle of death and life, Jesus breaks through that and says life, right? His death ultimately brings life. So that's where it diverges from the myth. Exactly. But what we have in our material humanistic society is we've actually kind of canceled or removed that pagan conception, in the sense that instead of talking about and thinking up, looking at the heavens and saying, wow, look, someone did this, it's creator, divine, and have that sense of awe, it's, we can go there in Google Earth, we can see it, and it's just, we can explain it. And so that's why, like Lewis would say, better to be a pagan and look up at the sky and wonder and want to worship the stars, rather than say, I'm bigger than them and I can explain it all. And so, in other words, if we go back to that point, we can say then that paganism, and many in the early church made this point, that it was the thing that was leading the Greco-Roman world to Christianity. And it's just, and even think about how Christianity itself took over the Roman Empire and became the dominant religion. And they didn't lose and suddenly become scientists that knew everything about every aspect. They realized that Christ, the story of the resurrection and the defeat of death, was the culmination of all of that. And I think in our culture, we've largely lost that process, particularly with Western education and the classics, this was such a huge part of that. Because science? Not necessarily because science. I mean, Christianity has always been, hand in hand with wanting to know science, and some of the best scientific discoveries we have in the ancient world, whether you're talking about Newton or others, they were coming from a religious and Christian perspective. Right, absolutely. It's just the advent, really, of secular humanism became a way of essentially putting all of the wonder of the universe and everything in the depths of time, or in the depths of law, and not having that personal creator that you are accountable to. Well, there's an urge to replace the creator with self. Sure. There's just an urge to say, no, I can do it on my own. Right. So maybe it's just, maybe that was the Enlightenment, was, we can be better than this. Sure, and self-fulfillment, the idea that I'm on my path and I need to fulfill my own meaning, and I can define that meaning. I can define my own truth. And define my own truth. And it's the natural de-evolution of all of that. So, yeah, I'd agree with that. The natural what? De-evolution? The natural de-evolution of the big idea. It's slowly de-evolving to where we now, we need to have our own values, we have to have our own purpose, but now you can define our own truth. In fact, it's the next step in that process. I just saw the World Economic Forum. There's a woman speaking, and she says we're getting to the place where we have to redefine our human rights, and the right to freedom of speech, and the right to be free from online bullying. And I'm like, well, those are two different things, and I'm not sure you
I'm not sure we're talking about the same, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's just,
Yeah.
And ultimately it's all a power struggle, is it not?
Sure. It's a power struggle. I mean, in the biblical text, if we're going back to the mythology, not in the sense of not true, as a myth, as we come to believe, but the mythic struggle of the forces of good and evil. That's really at the heart. There. You know, the mythic struggle, the cosmic struggle, and you know, there are clear forces of good and clear forces of evil in the biblical story, and there's certainly, I mean, I believe as a Christian, there's certainly at work in our day.
Outside the biblical story as well, exactly.
All down through.
So if you're, oh good, we're going to have somebody join us. We're actually at the hotel. Did you need to come up here? He's just going to squeeze by.
No problem.
All right, well, that's just what happens when you're live. Anyway, oh, I know what I wanted to ask you. Why did you name your first child after me?
Yeah, good question. You know, it's prophetic. No, I actually.
We only just met.
Yeah.
On this endeavor.
Right.
So talk to me about this particular endeavor. So this, because granted, our question and answer just sort of went completely into, in a sense, a different topic, but it's not a different topic, right? Because it's all interwoven and interconnected. So this movie is trying to trace the journey of the Ark of the Covenant,
right, and the tabernacle,
and the tabernacle which housed the Ark of the Covenant. So, first of all, why is that important?
So I'll answer your first question about my son. My son's name is Samuel, and I'll come back to that.
Because you're brilliant.
Yes, it's a great name, and I love that biblical story. We were just at Shiloh yesterday, and he's alone as a young boy inside the tent of the Lord, and it talks about how the menorah had not gone out, and it's the sense of God's Spirit is still in there, even in these bad days, in the days of the judges, when when everyone's doing what was right in their own eyes. There's no king. God still has a plan, and He's calling this boy Samuel, which means God hears,
right?
And it's God has listened to the prayer of his mother Hannah, which means, by the way, Yahweh answers. And so you have this very nice thing, and I've always just thought that was such a beautiful story. And Samuel is not the king, but he is someone who's also humble and is one who wants to pass the reins over. And I love those kind of characters that can both step into the spotlight, but also can step to the side when the time's right. So in a sense,
it's a wish onto
your
son.
Sure, it is. So, my son Sam is my oldest. Now, about the project. The project's name is a tentative title. The tentative title for this documentary.
It's not. I renamed it already.
She renamed it. I'll give you the title. You can give her your title, Sam. We're calling it tentatively Abide the Tent. Abide the Tent. The idea is that God wants to abide with His people. He wants to dwell with us. There's this great text in Psalm 15, who shall abide in my tent? Who shall dwell in the holy mountain? And it's this idea of we need to come before God in holiness. And God has actually come down to us. And He's created a way after the fall in the Garden of Eden. The first way is the tabernacle. And so that's really what the movie is about, is, first of all, why the tabernacle? Why the Ark of the Covenant? What is the reason why they come into being in the first place? And
there was a very vivid description of how the tabernacle would be built, what it would look like, written in the Bible.
Yes. We have, actually in Exodus, we have it twice.
Right.
Because Moses, when he goes up to Mount Sinai, God gives him instructions. He's up there 40 days, without food and water, the text says, and the people are waiting, and while they're there, that's when they have the golden calf episode.
They built themselves a calf.
Yeah. And so he has to break the first 10 commandments, and so he has to go back and get the instructions once more, and only then does he consecrate the tabernacle and the ark, which is his mobile throne. God's presence rests above the cherubim, these two angelic beings on top, and inside you have the book of the law, and all that's housed in this tent. And one of the so we have like a theological component. We see the bigger idea of God dwelling with humanity, and we can point to the Garden of Eden, and we have cherubim in the Garden of Eden guarding the way to the tree of life, we have the tree of life in the idea of the menorah. We have the altar even in the tabernacle courtyard, much like you have in Genesis 3, where Adam and Eve received skins from the Lord, clothing that required animal sacrifice, animal death. And that comes right before the first presentation of the gospel in Genesis 3:15. And that is where God promises that the seed of the woman, the seed of Eve, will crush the head of the snake, crush the head of the serpent, but his heel will be bruised. And of course, this points ultimately to Christ. So it's all tied together in just a really interesting way to see those biblical connections. One thing that we've really been fascinated by is not only do we see, let's call those literary parallels between how we can go between God's presence in the Garden of Eden, which is a kind of temple-like setting, to the tabernacle, which is in some sense a mobile Sinai. God's presence on Mount Sinai in the cloud that Moses encountered first in the bush and on the mountain is now traveling with them and directing them as God among them, but ultimately their king. We can also see that compared to Egypt, because Egypt had, in the late Bronze Age, which is about 1500 to 1200 BC, precisely when this narrative is happening in Exodus, all of their hopes and dreams in society are really pinned on Pharaoh. Pharaoh is to them a god incarnate while he is alive. They believed that he took on the form of one deity, Horus, while he was alive. This is the falcon-headed one. When he died, he became Osiris, and he has other manifestations as well. But his job is to keep everything in order. And so when we have the Exodus, everything is thrown into disorder. And one of the other things that we see is in the tabernacle, Pharaoh would go on campaign and fight these battles against these great enemies. And a famous one, the most well-known battle in the ancient world, is the Battle of Kadesh on the Orontes in about 1290, 1270 BC. And we have Pharaoh in his tent. It's a courtyard like this. And then in the middle, you have a tent, at the back of which, on the east, you have two winged beings over the throne name of Ramses II. And all around are his warriors. And it's showing that he is defeating them by driving the Hittites into the sea, and even brags about how he does this, that they all fell down into the water. And even some of the same language that you see in Exodus, like 14 and 15, echoes that same idea. And so in the Exodus, if we think about the ancient background from Egypt, we can see that God, Yahweh of the Old Testament, is out-Pharaohing Pharaoh. He is smiting down the enemies with his outstretched right arm, just as Pharaoh is often seen doing. He is destroying the chaos of the waters, which is something that the ancient mind was so enamored with. The sea itself can't be controlled. And so then the tabernacle essentially becomes not only a place for people to commune with God, be made right with sin, and to come into his holy presence, but itself becomes having a civic and military function. And we see throughout the narratives, it's the tabernacle that Moses goes to, or Joshua goes to, and they have to be told, what should we do next? How shall we defeat these enemies? And it's just so interesting that you have almost an exact parallel to that in Egypt. And there's many others. I mean, the Ark of the Covenant itself, King Tut's tomb, is like almost every description you read of the Ark has a parallel, from the cherubim to the ridge that we have on top, sometimes referred to as the mercy seat. So you can use those objects made from gold by Egyptians from the same time period. Remember, Israel's coming out of Egypt, to say this is what the ark and its utensils might have looked like. Now, God in Revelation is changing some of the meaning of these elements, but what they would have looked like and even some of their function are retained in the Bible.
But it's so fascinating, because when you say basically the instruction manual for building the ark, building the tabernacle, basically is informed by what was happening at the same time in Egypt, or prior in Egypt. It makes it so easy, in a sense, to say, well, then they just made it up because they came out of Egypt, and then they had those instructions, so they just did they did only what they knew.
Yeah.
You take the different point of view and you say, God made it so that they could automatically identify.
Exactly. I think that you're hitting right the nail on the head, because my perspective is God is real, God is alive, and He's acting in human history, whether we're talking about pagans, atheists, believers in the one true God. And so we're all reflective of God's image. And in terms of an archaeologist, in terms of someone who sees history, as well as someone who believes the scriptures to be God's truth and revelation, God works through culture. I mean, and we're accepting this.
Okay. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, so this was something that we talked about early on.
Mm-hmm.
It comes from a C.S. Lewis essay.
Mm-hmm.
I got it from a C.S. Lewis essay called what's it called?
Transposition.
Transposition. Thank you. I'm right. So
yeah, I think so.
Transposition is the idea that God's language is bigger than A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, and He has to transpose what He wants to say into language that we can understand.
Sure.
And sometimes it's language that we don't understand, right? So right now we're dealing with the aftermath of the Uvalde shooting, and this is something that we don't understand, and there's a lot of pain because it just seems so horrific.
Yeah.
But I'm sure that your point of view is God is in that also.
Sure.
And because we don't understand or we can't see, doesn't mean that He's not there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, God is working. God is working through all of this for His plan, for His purposes. We don't always see what the plan is. That doesn't mean we're left to not do anything about the circumstances, and we have a duty to do with be placed in the circumstances that we are. But when we talk about this, we talk about this idea of culture. We see at the level of language. Let's say the Bible's written in Hebrew, the Bible's written in Greek, and no one says, God has to write it in a heavenly language for that revelation to come, because he comes down and uses.
But there's a transfer that happens.
There is,
because I read it in English.
Sure.
Because I don't read Hebrew and I don't read Greek.
Right, and that's important. And that truth still comes through.
And it's not necessarily 1-on-1.
It isn't.
Or 1-to-1, I should say. The ratio is, and this is what's fascinating with language for me, is the ratio is never 1-to-1. Almost never 1-to-1.
Right.
Also because context is so important.
Sure.
So we've talked about words that they mean one thing, or they mean three things in Hebrew. They get translated into one word in English, and that word doesn't mean the same three things that it started out by.
Right. Definitely. And usage of words over time. And we do have quite a ways of Hebrew or Greek to compare to. But I think it's just as important.
The usage, right?
How is it
part of the
context? But it can change, even within the same language, it can change over time. Just as English, from Shakespeare today,
that's what
you
we're
can
saying,
have
right?
very
so Old
different
Hebrew is different than current Hebrew.
Definitely.
In fact, one of the things that we talked about that I found, I'm learning so much, but this idea of Samuel, that means God hears.
Right.
But our two experts who are on the show in a little bit, individually and together, they brought up the concept that Hannah was praying silently.
Right.
Which is not something that was done. So contextually, that's an anomaly. She was praying silently to the point where somebody would have said, "What's wrong with you? Are you casting spells? Are you a witch?"
Yeah.
And she then named her son God Hears.
Right.
But God hears silent prayers.
Sure.
So that's maybe the introduction of this new concept in the Bible itself.
Yeah.
That God hears you all the time.
Yeah.
Not just when you're praying out loud.
Right, and I think that's such a good point, because in the modern church, let's say, in our evangelical world, we are individualistic. We are looking for these spiritual elements, and sometimes when we approach the Old Testament, we say, the God of the Old Testament just seems so far and distant. But you have these stories like this that are so rich, and it's the same idea of this personal God that you can reach out to, and we have it throughout the Bible, that those who faithfully seek the Lord will find Him. And Hannah, that's the great example of that story through prayer there. And I would just say, if we think about this idea of context, language is one thing, but just as important is to know the concept, the culture in which it occurred, and so to understand the way that they thought about the world, the way they thought about the heavens, the way that they think about the day-to-day life. That's where archaeology and other ancient texts besides the Bible really inform us about the ancient world. And even especially, like, for instance, to better understand the New Testament, it's often really helpful to read the Apocrypha or the Pseudepigrapha, these texts that come before.
Stop
okay,
it.
sorry for these names, but these
so bad.
These I'm sorry.
No, you can be banned from the show.
I know.
You don't use big words like that.
Pseudepigrapha, it's a $5
We actually
word.
have 1 minute, so
Yeah.
you're gonna have to sum it up. I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem.
Let's
1 minute.
not talk Greek.
So let's do this. The movie. Let's go back to that.
Let's do that.
Abide the Tent.
No.
Or maybe Indiana
Who? Tracers of the Lost Ark.
Something like that. In Gesher Media, in this film, in all of our film projects, what Gesher Media is trying to accomplish, Gesher means bridge, is to be a bridge between the world of the Bible as we see it in archaeology, geography, history, culture, the world that I live in, love, and entirely
clearly.
I like to be there, but I think it's so interesting to people once they see it, to bring all of that goodness that exists out there to people in a way that they can relate to it. Not just that they feel good about it, but that they feel themselves in the story.
To make it alive.
To make it alive. To have the meta-narrative of the Bible be understood known and bring it together with all this background.
In fact, that's why Kevin and I did our tour to Israel. We're doing another one. Gesher might actually be doing a tour. We're talking about that. Because it changes you when you see these they're big concepts, they're God concepts in stone.
Right.
In the streets of Jerusalem, in the history that's here, in the archaeological dig at Shiloh, etc. And this is the stuff of life. This is the important stuff. And so thank you very much for coming on the show. Chris McKinney.
Happy to do it.
Do you have a website? He's written several books.
Yeah, so we do, GesherMedia.com. That's the company that I work for, making these documentaries. I also have a podcast.
That's
on Script Biblical World, or you can just type in Biblical World in Apple or wherever you like to listen to podcasts. I'm going to go on the podcast,
but I'm just going to say dumb stuff.
So those would be the two. I have books, but it probably wouldn't be interesting to know. But I also, so I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
No, I think there are some people out there who would totally nerd out on all of that stuff. I'm Sam Sorbo. Thanks so much for watching.